Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Wray, I was there in Alexandria, Virginia on the morning of June 14, 2017, when a shooter attacked Republican members of Congress practicing for a charity baseball game. That event concerns me just as much as the January event here at the Capitol, and I assume you remember that attack. The attacker was living in his van near the baseball field along the third base line for 2 months. We know from his social media posts that he hated Republicans and he hated President Trump. He loved Bernie Sanders and he held left-wing beliefs. We know he carried in his pocket that day a target list with names of Republican congressmen in his pocket that included their physical descriptions. Before carrying out his attack, we know that the attacker asked Congressman Jeff Duncan, who was leaving practice early, if those present on the field were Republicans or Democrats. He was told they were Republicans. We know that he was heavily armed. He had a rifle and a handgun and plenty of ammunition, and he used them all. We were later told that 136 rounds were fired that morning. By the grace of God, it was the last day of practice before the game, and the pitchers and catchers were not in the bullpen, which was located just beyond the third base dugout, which is where the attacker first opened fire. By the grace of God, the groundskeeper locked the third base gate the night before, which he doesn't usually do. The attacker's first shot, aimed at Trent Kelly at third base, a member of this committee, hit a link in the fence and therefore barely missed Mr. Kelly. By the grace of God, this field had dugouts that go down 5 or 6 steps, and it served as a bunker for many of the members. Many members were injured diving into that dugout, and you can likely still see the bullet holes in the upper parts of the dugout as the attacker kept pursuit, while using the third base dugout for his own cover. By the grace of God, Steve Scalise was there that day, and he took a bullet for all of us, and he barely survived. If Majority Whip Steve Scalise wasn't there, then Capitol Police are not there to save our lives. The Capitol Police were in plain clothes, sitting in an unmarked vehicle, unbeknownst to the attacker. That's an important point. By the grace of God, none of us were killed, although 5 were wounded, including both Capitol Police. The attacker was ultimately hit and died, taken down by Capitol Police and Alexandria Police. Without the police being there and bravely responding, this insurrection would have been a massacre. Trapped in a field would have been 20 to 30 Republicans assassinated, and the attacker may have believed that he could change the balance of power in the U.S. House of Representatives in one morning. Interestingly, I'm not aware of any members present that day being called as witnesses by the FBI, including me and Mr. Kelly. On November 16, 2017, FBI agents briefed those of us that were at the field that day, and they gave us an overview of some of the events that day as though we didn't know it. We were there. We were witnesses. Much to our shock that day, the FBI concluded that this was a case of the attacker seeking suicide by cop. Director, you want suicide by cop? You just pull a gun on a cop. It doesn't take 136 rounds. It takes 1 bullet. Both the DHS and the ODNI published products labeling this attack as a domestic violent extremism event, specifically targeting Republican members of Congress. The FBI did not. The FBI still has not. And my colleagues across the aisle don't seem concerned about this particular event. It could have been a massacre. On November 18, 2019, I went over to the FBI to discuss this conclusion. Although the agents were not part of that investigation, they did not agree that this was suicide by cop. And it's my firsthand opinion that this was an attempted assassination of many Republican members of Congress. Mr. Wray, do you know who the acting director of the FBI was on the day of the attack, June 14, 2017?
Yes, because I was not the director at the time.
It was Andrew McCabe. You know, I have a letter here that I'm requesting that you investigate the shooting of June 14, 2017 as an act of domestic terrorism and investigate how the FBI came to decide that this was deemed suicide by cop by the FBI and who made that call. And I'd appreciate a written response from the Bureau. And Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that a copy of the letter be included in the record.
Without objection.
I grew up watching a TV show called FBI with Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. I adored the FBI. I trusted the FBI. Mr. Wray, when you were nominated, I was hopeful you would bring about change in the FBI. And I stated publicly that you had the opportunity to clear the FBI's reputation and establish trust with the American people. Instead, I'm concerned that things have further degraded, and I would ask, what do you intend to do about the reputation of the FBI and the distrust the American people have?
Mr. Chairman, may I be heard on that one point? Because the
Yes,
FBI's reputation is something that matters deeply to me,
Of
just
course.
as it does to every member of this committee. I have been committed since I started this job to making sure that the FBI does the right thing in the right way. And I have tried to instill that message through everything we do. And as far as the FBI's reputation with the American people, I have been out to all 56 field offices, most of them more than once, met with partners in the law enforcement community in all 50 states, met with judges, met with prosecutors, met with victims' families. And the reputation that I see and hear of our people and the great work they're doing out in those communities differs greatly, with all due respect to the assessment that we just heard. And I would add to that over the last couple of years, the number of Americans applying to be special agents of the FBI has tripled what it was in the years before I started in the job, and it's as high as it's been in over a decade. And I think that speaks volumes about Americans all across the country wanting to be special agents of the FBI and to put their lives on the line to commit the same kind of heroic acts that Congressman Wenstrup very appropriately cited in connection with a horrific attack at that baseball field on that day. And I just want to say, sir, that I am not only grateful to the Capitol Police for what they did that day, but to your own life-saving intervention on behalf of Congressman Scalise and others.
I look forward to following up with you on my request. Thank you, sir.
Ms. Spear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually would like to associate your comments with my interest in wanting to pursue that as